Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Tiffany Archer, and I'm the founder and president of Eunomia Risk Advisory. Eunomia Global, our sister organization, leads our strategic partnerships and initiatives outside the United States. Our work focuses on advancing governance, risk, and compliance through behavioral science and data analytics, whereby we support leaders, organizations, and institutions across sectors. It's an honor to welcome you to the inaugural session of the Eunomia Global Executive Roundtable series. We are so thrilled to have participants joining us from more than 20 countries across Africa, the Middle East, India, Europe, as well as the United States. And this diversity reflects the growing global relevance of AI and shaping Africa's development trajectory. Today marks the first in a series of executive dialogues focused on strengthening Africa's governance, risk, as well as compliance ecosystems, addressing themes such as digital transformation, ethics, anti-corruption, as well as financial resilience. Today's session focuses on AI in Africa, exploring how artificial intelligence is influencing economic development, regulation, and trust, and how African leadership can define the next frontier of ethical innovation. Before we move into introductions, I'd like to extend our sincere gratitude to our partners as well as sponsors. This includes the African Corporate Governance Network, ACGN, Ethics and Compliance Initiative, ECI, as well as Compliance Week. Your collaboration and shared commitment to advancing ethical governance, education, and leadership across Africa has been instrumental in making this event possible. To help us unpack today's theme, we are joined by an exceptional panel of leaders representing technology, investment, law, and governance, each of whom bring a distinct perspective on how Africa can harness AI responsibly and inclusively. So let's begin with Sipho Matambene. He's the Government Affairs and Public Policy Manager at Google South Africa. Sipho's work focuses on advancing public policy that enables digital transformation, innovation, and responsible AI adoption across the region. Sipho, we're so delighted to have you with us today. Building on that, I'd like to welcome Michael Moutier, Investment Manager with Launch Africa Ventures. Michael brings deep expertise in supporting early stage ventures and scaling innovation ecosystems across Africa, particularly those driving AI and frontier technology solutions. Next, I'd like to turn to Otilia Firi, Head of Legal Affairs for Egypt, Nigeria, and Morocco at Microsoft Kenya. Otilia leads governance and regulatory engagement across several key markets, helping navigate complex and evolving legal landscapes across the continent. And we'll also hear from Nitesh Ramji, partner at Dentons South Africa, where he specializes in public policy and regulation. He has been instrumental in advising on digital policy, ESG, and regulatory frameworks that bridge local, global governance with execution. And finally, rounding out our distinguished panel, we have Dr. Shefali Yogendra, a portfolio non-executive director and senior executive advisor. Her perspective connects emerging and establishing markets, highlighting how Africa's experience can help shape global AI standards. So before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. First and foremost, this is an interactive session, so we highly encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A feature. As moderator, I'll be monitoring them throughout, and we'll channel your questions to our speakers in real time. Also, today's roundtable is structured as a two-part session. The first segment will be exploring practical realities, covering the regulatory landscape, infrastructure and compute gaps, capital flows, youth and workforce development, and more. This will run until 1:25 p.m. GMT, after which we'll take a 10-minute break. We'll resume promptly at 1:35 GMT for the second segment, where we'll focus on the future state of AI in Africa, including themes such as continental leadership, clean energy, governance, and AI safety, as well as local innovation. And we will conclude promptly at 2:30 p.m. GMT. Following the session, you will receive a survey to the email that you used for your registration. Please make sure that you complete this to receive your certificate of completion, as well as to qualify for your CPD credit. So with that, thank you all for joining us, and we will now hop into the program. So first and foremost, I'd like to note that as AI adoption accelerates, Africa faces a critical question. Can governance frameworks really keep pace with innovation? Across Africa, there are more than 30 countries now that have national data protection laws or AI-related policies. Yet there's still no harmonized framework. The African Union's AI policy framework does offer important guidance, but adoption appears to remain uneven and also non-binding. So this fragmentation continues to create uncertainty for both businesses and investors. So with that, Sifo, I'd like to start with you. You recently participated in a panel discussion on AI sovereignty in Africa, where you noted that, quote, sovereignty requires more than just commute. It demands strong data residency, local data, localized models, as well as a clear national strategy. So I was hoping you could share a few key highlights or takeaways from that discussion.
Thanks, Tiffany. As you correctly point out, a lot of African countries have been thinking about AI sovereignty in relation to data sovereignty and data localization. And this is why you'll find a lot of the laws that have been passed, or some of the policies that have been passed, really talk more about data localization rather than the broader AI sovereignty. For us at Google, what we think about when we think about sovereignty is not about digital isolation, but it's about the digital capabilities. So of any nation to be able to build, adapt, and govern AI solutions that are going to serve their particular needs. So this takes us beyond just compute. You do need, for instance, to be able to build local capacity in order to be able to have these AI models that are going to be built in such a manner that they're going to be able to address the context in local settings. You need to address language, for instance. You need to be able to address the nuances of any particular nation. And only by building the local capacity would you be able to do so. You then obviously need to have open infrastructure and be able to have infrastructure that is going to build an innovative landscape, or a landscape that's going to allow for innovation from various different parties within the ecosystem. And obviously part of it for us, and this is why I think we say it's not digital isolation, but it is quite important to still maintain strategic partnerships within the continent and globally, just understanding that digital markets do operate in that manner. So I think as we think about AI sovereignty, from our point of view, really, it is definitely a conversation that is to be had beyond that data localization issue, but is going to deal with local skills, necessary infrastructure, building partnerships, and then obviously setting the rules and having policies in place that are going to allow for an innovative AI ecosystem in order to build that capacity for any nation within the African context, but also even within Africa itself. Thanks.
Thank you. And just to push a little further on that point, you also noted the phrase strong data residency. And I was just curious, what does that look like for countries that are still trying to harmonize the balance between innovation, regulation, and trust?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing is to make sure that there are systems in place to be able to have local data in ways that are going to be able to be accessible and used. For a lot of nations, this has been kind of moving from traditional methods into cloud computing, for instance. So when you think about cloud first nations that have been able to kind of adopt cloud first policies, they've been able to kind of make sure that their local data is in a manner and in a format that it can be useful. Obviously, in relation to ensuring that there are protections, and this is why I said AI sovereignty isn't necessarily about data sovereignty. Data sovereignty can be achieved in many different ways, which is not necessarily about localizing data or maintaining it only within the borders of a country. You can ensure data sovereignty through the controls that exist now within the technologies that we have, which give parties access to their, for instance, encrypted data on the cloud. We at Google, I know we operate on a zero trust basis where a customer's data remains theirs and they're the ones who have control of it. And this is what the data sovereignty issue is about. It is about who controls that data. So it necessarily does not mean African countries need to think about handing over their data to service providers or third parties. But maintaining that control is one way to ensure that that sovereignty is maintained. But how that control is done can be done in many different ways, and protections in place.
Yeah, and finally, I know we talked about kind of what sovereignty really means and how we can maintain ownership over data, but what are the risks that you see arising from some of the fragmented regulation across these 30 plus data protection regimes?
Yeah, I mean, in the context of a world where we're trying to have the AFCFTA implemented, I think the 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 risk of isolation of any of those various different nations is that yes, you are able to kind of build for your people, but they're not able to have access to the rest of the markets and other markets that are going to be able to provide necessary inputs into your country. So this is again why I said that isolation is not necessarily the solution. Sovereignty can be achieved in different ways in terms of building capacity, but it's not isolation. We do need to have those partnerships, especially on the continent. If we were trying to build ourselves into a manner of being kind of the leader of the world's issues and being part of it, we need to be able to ensure that we leverage the various different powers and strengths that each country has. And we can only do that by a level of engagement and partnership between ourselves. So the risk is that we would fail to fully achieve and reach the potential of AI in each of our economies if we do not find a way to cooperate and have a collaborative framework that's going to allow that, while obviously having the protections that each nation wants to be able to maintain.
Thank you. And I love the phrase you use, collaborative framework. And I think that's a great transition to Shafali. In your view and through your experience, what role can African businesses and policymakers play in shaping Africa's voice within emerging BRICS and UN-led AI governance frameworks?
Thank you, Tiffany. So one of the key things, of course, in order to have a voice is to have a seat at the table and have a seat at the table in the front row, essentially, and also have some kind of clear idea which aligns with all the other African nations if you're representing one country on what it is that you're trying to create, what you're trying to achieve. And I think the three pillars of all of these governance frameworks, international frameworks, are ethics, coordination, and equitable access. And I think all three of them are quite different in terms of considerations. So an interesting conversation often is equality the same as equity? And equity is only possible if you're, first of all, allowed to participate. So I would say it sounds like a simple thing, but to have a seat at the table and have a very clear idea of what your point of view is on all of these three pillars. And then how far are you willing to negotiate if you have to negotiate one aspect versus another and give away some of it so that you can have more of the other. So I feel that that might be the hardest thing, because in your question, you talk about both businesses and policymakers, and they don't always have the same view on what the goals should be. So the nation state versus the enterprise that is at the table may have differing points of view. And I think to have arrived at a point of view before you sit at the table would be an interesting and useful exercise to having a voice that matters.
In your experience, just to follow up on that, do you have any advice to our audience as far as if someone wants a voice at the table, if they want to be part of this conversation? We're trying to marry views between business and potentially, diverging lenses between a business and a policymaker. What sorts of best practices have you seen, or suggestions can you give to allow for someone to maybe move a bit further to actually bring that chair to the table if they're not already receiving an invite?
I think the engagement between business and policymakers is key without actually any one business trying to capture the whole debate.
Sure.
You may have noticed last night, OpenAI essentially issued a call to have a federal backstop to their infrastructure investment. That is essentially a company which is saying, we are too big to fail, please support us. And that is one company essentially also capturing the attention of a country's government to say, look at me, don't look at other people. So an investigation or a pursuit of equity has to begin with states actually deciding how far they will go in engaging with particular businesses. But businesses also remembering that the whole ecosystem must thrive. Otherwise, one company thriving at the cost of others is not particularly good for the prosperity of a nation. So it sounds like I haven't given you a clear answer, but the process is messy. And in political science, they use the term muddling through for a reason. And we are all going to muddle through.
And we did just receive a comment from one of our attendees who is supportive of your view and saying that to have a voice, Africans, African leaders, and businesses need to show up and be involved in AI processes and systems, which I think completely buttresses the perspective that you put forward moments ago. And he noted that, however, deep down engagement shows there's no need for massive awareness creation for African actors. So I was curious if you had any reactions to that comment.
I agree with it. There is no need for creating awareness because that awareness is being already created by the louder, bigger players. But the key thing is to have an inner conversation inside countries to say, what is our point of view? What are our particular requirements that this toolkit might solve for us? And I know we'll come to it later in the conversation in different forms as well.
Yes. Thank you. I wanted to shift now to talk a little bit about infrastructure and compute gaps. Under recent analyses, we've seen, including the Africa Data Centers Association and several global consultancies stating that Africa's share of global compute capacity is under 1%, despite being one of the fastest growing regions for digital adoption and data center investment. And most recently, in October of 2025, Microsoft's AI Economy Institute released its AI Diffusion Report, which provides a sobering snapshot of this gap. And so, Attilia, before bringing you in, I just wanted to set the landscape for our audience to share a few key findings that come from that report. Namely, first, AI adoption in the global north is roughly double that of the global south. 18 of the 20 countries with the largest electricity access deficits are in sub-Saharan Africa. The continent has about 1.5 gigawatts of data center capacity compared to 53.9 gigawatts in the US and 31.9 gigawatts in China. Nearly 4 billion people globally still lack the basics needed to use AI. Sub-Saharan Africa accounts for 85% of the world's population without electricity, sadly. And then finally, countries with low resource languages adopt AI at 20% lower rates, even after controlling for things like GDP and internet access. So, the report identifies 5 essential building blocks of AI readiness, including electricity, data centers, internet access, digital skills, and then language. So, Attilia, with that context, I'd love to hear more about your view on how does this gap translate into real world barriers for African businesses and innovators?
Thank you for that, Tiffany. So maybe I'll call out three key areas where this is affecting African businesses. I think the first is we're seeing slow investment in some of the key infrastructure components that we need. And I think part of it is because of the reasons that you've described. I think the second bucket, electrification, is probably the key issue that we have if we think about all the facets of, okay, where would you start if you were going to try and solve for this, right? I think many people have been looking at, okay, should we be investing in infrastructure, in the data centers themselves, should we be investing in skilling? And those are all great places to start. But I think the biggest issue that we're going to have currently is electricity, and even solving that just for the capacity for our business to be able to be scalable currently without even thinking about the AI economy. I think that becomes a key area as well. So I think energy is probably the other area that it impacts businesses. And then maybe the third would be ecosystem or challenges around ease of doing business and operating. And I think of this in the context of, let's say I am a startup from Kenya and I would like to scale up. I think Sipo did a great job of speaking to some of the policy considerations that we have. And I think with the fragmentation that we have, if I am a Kenyan startup trying to scale up across the continent, how many different regimes do I need to consider as I build out my application or my business? And that creates a bit of a barrier in scalability, at least. I think we've seen a couple of great examples of startups that have been that are solving for African problems that have managed to scale up well, but it costs more because of this regulatory burden. So I think those are some of the areas where I'm seeing, African businesses being affected, at least from a competitive perspective in this AI economy.
And a follow-up to that, when we're talking about infrastructure, electricity, power, so on and so forth, Emmanuel has a comment here that I'd like to share with you for your reaction. He says, the cost and infrastructure needed for African data centers that can be used to build Afrocentric solutions is so enormous that many African countries cannot afford, well, it's unaffordable. So how can we innovate, knowing that we have to overcome some of these obstacles and challenges?
I think we're starting to see an interesting thing happen in some unconventional partnerships. And I know that this is something that we've spoken about a bit, Tiffany, and we might go further in detail as the session goes. But I think one example I will give, let's look at NVIDIA and Liquid's Cassava Technologies and their recent announcement on doing AI factories across some of the 5 key strategic markets across Africa. I think we've also seen growing investments in that collaboration as well, and that's a good indicator. I think that is where the opportunity lies. I think we're also seeing, from a Microsoft perspective at least, you may have seen an announcement that we made about a year or so ago of a collaboration with UAE-based G42 in a potential data center infrastructure in Kenya. And that's, unconventional, where you're seeing some of the frontier AI companies collaborating with what are some of the very well-funded Gulf countries and sovereign wealth funds in building out infrastructure. So I feel like there's interesting things that are happening where there is a keen interest for money to move in this space. But I think even with the investment of the data center infrastructure, if this is not done collaboratively with solving for our electricity issue, then we're not really going to get to the scale that we need. So we actually need a lot more investment, I think, in energy efficiency and growing our energy capacity as well at the same time.
Thank you. Thank you. And we will talk more about unconventional partnerships a touch later, as well as investments. But before I get to that, thank you, Ottilia, for the important points that you've raised. And, you noted that the fact that before AI can truly take hold, we have to tackle, what some may refer to as kind of old world issues, electricity, data access, basic infrastructure, maybe things that some people in other countries take that as the norm, right? Nitesh, for you, I'm curious, from a governance and policy perspective, how do policymakers prioritize and sequence these investments? Is there a way to address some of these foundational gaps in parallel rather than sequentially? So, for example, progress on digital policy, innovation, and infrastructure actually happens, together.
I think we are in very interesting times when it comes to policy development. I think that we also need to take things back and just state that Africa is more than 50 countries and 1.5 billion people and an incredible amount of diversity. So in trying to get things to evolve in a uniform way, it's almost equivalent to saying we need a world policy on AI and that everything is going to turn out smoothly. So I think, as Shefali was saying, we're going to have to muddle through. And we're talking about a lot of big picture things here. But I think that a lot of AI innovation, use, and accompanying policy drive is going to come from micro innovation and the needs of the people. So I also heard quite recently somebody refer to AI not just as artificial intelligence, but African intelligence. So I think that we are going to develop our own unique approach to developing policy frameworks and then eventually cascading this down into legislation. I think we've got the building blocks in place with the African Union documents, with the African Continental Free Trade Area documents, with the regional economic communities. In a few days' time, we'll be hosting the G20 summit here in South Africa. And as Sipo was saying, some countries have a cloud-first policy. I do hope sincerely that we're going to see leaders like our President Cyril Ramaphosa put AI to the top of the agenda, because this is really something that can, despite all of the challenges, leapfrog development. And it's not like other issues of the past. We're all kind of starting at the same point. We're at the genesis. So let's get on the bus now and see if we can be part of a bigger picture in terms of formulating workable policy and regulation.
And you just used the term leapfrog, and one of our attendees actually has a question about the concept of leapfrogging, indicating that, is there a way that African countries and customers can use AI to leapfrog some of these internal impediments that we're seeing, continentally? So obviously access to electricity and the internet are serious obstacles, but this individual is thinking how cell phones leapfrog landlines, right, in many African countries. Perhaps cell phones could be the vehicle by which AI tools could be accessed. Nitesh, this is for you and really anyone else who has comments or views. I think this is a great point.
I think that cell phones are, a fundamental cornerstone. How are we going to drive AI? Yes, electricity, yes, data is an issue at a micro level, but we have seen so many innovations and great progress. So let me give you an example. I was doing some work in Malawi a few years ago, and we had a good agricultural practices program that I was monitoring. And we saw that a simple intervention of people using a treadle pump, which is the equivalent of a stepping machine in a gym, versus hand irrigation in some access and the ability to download an app. You can diagnose a disease in your crop very easily. Or when you have doctors who are in training, they are obliged in South Africa, for example, to do a year of community service. So you would find those people looking to whoever they knew in their personal network to try and get some information about a case that they're dealing with. But now all of a sudden using AI, they're able to get best-in-class information as if they were dealing with the world's experts. So I think it's just boiling it down into very simple, bite-sized chunks to be able to understand and comprehend, because often we get lost in this massive label, which is AI, and we don't know where it starts and where it ends. So I think sometimes we need to just take a step back and realize that it's going to be very practical steps which are going to take us forward.
Thank you, Nitesh. Ottilia, I see your hands up.
I agree, and I love that kind of focus on the use cases and how the disruption really happens at like a ground level, and I quite agree with you, Nitesh. But I think it's also worthwhile noting that if we look at mobile penetration and internet penetration, while the narrative has always been that we have good mobile and internet penetration across the continent. If you actually look at it, if you drill down into the numbers, I think we're probably only at about 28% of actual mobile penetration, right? There are still many people who don't have access to a device that would be able to access, AI tools, or even that has internet connectivity, right? So for the most part, you would see that there is widespread adoption of the traditional USSD devices, which are great, and there are ways that you can also implement AI use cases leveraging the old school USSD devices. But for the type of transformational activities and processing of data that's required for some of these emerging large language models, you wouldn't be able to do that on a USSD phone, and you would need a smartphone. And the price of access for that type of hardware connected, and as well then the cost of internet connectivity, then means there are a lot of people even at that ground level perspective who wouldn't be able to have access to these services. So I think I agree with you that we should focus on the disruption that can happen at a use case level and the opportunity that's available, and kind of really keep it realistic there. But I do think there's also some work that needs to be done to find affordable broadband that connects more people to the internet, and then also some investments in bringing down the cost of acquisition for mobile devices so that we can have more devices in people's hands as well.
Shefali, please.
I would just like to add something and build on the points made by Nitesh and Ottilia, because an interesting thing which Steve Sinofsky, whose name might be familiar to Ottilia because he's a Microsoft guy, he made a comment that the handsets in people's hands are the distributed inference engine that we are all really looking for. So when you think about the leapfrog versus incumbency challenge, there has to be a different way of solving the problem rather than the way that is being given from the loudest voices in this conversation. And I think when we think about the infrastructure and compute challenge and how should Africa, with like less than 1% compute share, approach this, the thinking has to be different. It doesn't have to replicate or implement what is being given, but to think ground out, that the mobile first thing is how a lot of African nations actually first access the internet. And yes, I agree with Ottilia that the handsets have to be affordable and be in the hands of many, many people. But then 28% came up from 0% at some point in time. So the progress is in the right direction. The incumbency problem is much smaller, and leapfrogging is more possible because people are used to using their mobile devices to do things. At the same time, the mobile devices could also be a solution to a problem using something which we call edge devices, essentially. So that kind of addresses some of the other challenges in the compute data model and cloud sort of foursome pillar that makes for generative AI, which is what we are discussing.
Thank you. The question here that has a connection to what we've just been discussing is the following, and I'd love feedback from anyone here on the panel. So shouldn't there be more focus on investing digital public infrastructure to enable AI usage? And this person is indicating, again, the energy deficiency is clearly all over Africa and has to be solved, as Ottilia is stating, but given how data centers use AI's leverage on and use such an enormous amount of an energy source, perhaps should there be a focus on more of a centralized solution? We can always table that for the future.
I mean, I can start with some perspectives. One of the ways to, okay, when we talk about digital public infrastructure, the first thing that immediately came to mind is which of our African governments really has the funding to be able to support doing these comprehensive projects. I mean, I think we were seeing great progress in the likes of South Africa, perhaps in digitizing how they provide public services, and in some other countries as well across the continent. But the funding required to create digital public infrastructure, I think we land in the same place. Where would the money come from? And I think there are some multilateral organizations like the World Bank and others who are funding in this space, and maybe there is an opportunity there. On the idea of how could we create some centralized resources? I think there's a shift to thinking, could we have more infrastructure that serves regional economic zones? Perhaps we are a lot more integrated from an African continent at the regional economic level. For example, in the South, SADC, in East African Community here in the East, ECOWAS in the West. And those might be where some of the opportunity lies, where if we were to think of these as blocks and there was better integration, even from a policy framework perspective, and greater trust as well between those countries, could you then have some, collaborative infrastructure at that level? And I think there's a great opportunity there. Those are some maybe of my early perspectives. The funding, because it's something we've also been trying to solve for. And then, yes, I think there likely is an opportunity as well at the regional economic level.
Thank you. And Shefali.
Yeah, I would like to contribute one point to that conversation. And it is not important to invent everything by oneself. Every country doesn't have to. And if we look at the Global South as an example or as a crucible of innovation, India has a fairly advanced digital public infrastructure point of view, and an open protocol such as Beacon is available, whichever country wants to use it. So to our earlier and other conversations about should we align how should African nations sit at the table to participate in and lend their voice to the BRICS and UN-led AI regulation, this is also worth considering. There is a lot more happening in the other Global South countries, which are similar in infrastructure challenges in terms of having access to data, having electricity coverage, and so on and so forth. It's worth looking into those instead of worrying about the thing have to be reinvented for this context. Look at similar contexts and just lift things from there because they work for you. And they're open platforms and they're open protocols. So it's not like anybody is going to say you stole my IP.
That is fair. That's a fair point. Thank you, Shefali. I wanted to bring in a comment that came in earlier, which is which African country is leading in AI at present? And I also wanted to now bring in Michael Mudier. Michael, one of the key pillars of Agenda 2063 is fostering intra-African trade and innovation. AFTA was designed to help unlock those opportunities, yet capital flows remain heavily concentrated in just a few markets, primarily the big four, being Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt. So while AFTA provides this policy framework, many observers note that implementation has lagged beyond actual ambition. And I know that you recently visited AFTA's headquarters, so I'd really love to hear your perspective on, one, addressing, in your view, who is leading in AI at the moment, but also, is AFTA beginning to unlock capital flows beyond those dominant markets?
Thanks, Tiffany. And hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon for everyone joining. I apologize. I've been off video. I had explained to Tiffany, I just had a loss. I lost one of my immediate family members. So you know how we do it the African way. You have friends and family visiting to condole with us. So I will be off video time and again. But thank you so much for having Launch Africa Ventures as part of this conversation, Tiffany. I think although the whole premise of AFTA being in existence is to facilitate and to deepen relations amongst the 55 member states of the African Union to deepen the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. And I think the implementation of AfTA protocols and broader investment linkages beyond dominant markets, which is the Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, South Africa, it still remains uneven. If you look at issues like non-tariff barriers, regulatory fragmentation, which has come up from when Sifo was speaking, and Otilia, and I think infrastructure gaps, which remain some of the biggest obstacles, especially for smaller and landlocked economies, we are still lagging behind. So if you look at the larger flows of investments that continue to gravitate to certain markets on the continent, and the larger economies, for instance, if you look at how intra-African trade is still heavily dominated by a few large economies rather than being evenly distributed. So there is value. The intention for the AfTA framework and protocols is good. And I think from what I shared yesterday in our conversation, referencing the session we had with the Secretariat at the AfTA offices about 2 weeks ago, it's the implementation of these protocols or the policies that have been recommended within the AfTA framework by certain member states. I will not name some of the countries. There's one particular country that was named as being a problematic one that has yet to sign and agree to be a part of this. And they are one of the big four markets where a lot of the capital inflows are moving towards when it comes to especially VC funding on the continent. So, yeah, I think it is intentioned to deepen that intra-Africa trade and covering the free movement of people, capital, goods, and services. The protocols, if they get to work, would be absolutely beneficial to the regional economies. But as of yet, it is still being tried and tested. So it would be good to see it work. But as at present, it's still a lot of, I think it was one of the speakers touched on awareness. I think we're still at the awareness stage, and we're trying to get buy-in from different member states so we can actually get it live and working for the continent.
Thank you. And we also talked a little bit about, as we think about AI's growth across Africa, right, economic integration is critical. So with AfTA and new initiatives like the Ghana-Rwanda cross-border interoperability agreement, what signals are we seeing for more open borders and improved capital flows across regions?
Yeah, thank you, Tiffany. I think the Ghana-Rwanda licensing agreement essentially allows for businesses that are regulated and licensed in one market to be able to freely operate in the different markets. So that solves for the fragmentation that a lot of businesses struggle with when it comes to regulation. If you start a business in Kenya, in East Africa, scaling it just to the next door neighbors in Tanzania or Uganda or Rwanda, you have to deal with a different framework or regulator, and you have to apply for the same qualifications or certifications or licenses, and it takes time and it takes capital. Where I sit, we work with a lot of early stage businesses. Just for as a refresher, I work with a Pan-African VC fund called Launch Africa Ventures. We're in our 5th year of operation. We've to date backed about 170 companies in 25 markets across the African continent, and we back tech-enabled businesses. We are sector agnostic, so we cover a wide range of sectors, from your fintech, agri-tech, health tech, ed tech, and so on and so forth. And so looking at the ease of, or rather looking at interoperability, stuff like what is happening with Rwanda and Ghana is a great signal for the continent, but obviously a lot more needs to be done. And I think it started with African countries realizing that they need to first open up borders. For instance, just 3 years ago, Ghanaian would require South African visa to enter South Africa. As a Kenyan, I would require a South African visa that I'd have to apply it at the South African High Commission in Kenya, and it would take at least a month for me, or 2 weeks to a month for me to get that visa. But now if I need to go to South Africa, it is as easy as just boarding, getting a ticket and getting to South Africa and getting my visa on arrival. And so a lot is happening from countries slowly realizing that there's a benefit to opening up borders on the continent. And now we are seeing, initiatives such as what Rwanda and Ghana are having, also preceded by looking at governments that started putting up together startup acts, just finding ways to encourage more innovation and entrepreneurship from within their ecosystems and providing support in a way that allows for these economies to bloom from homegrown innovations. So there's absolute benefit to more and more countries opening up their borders and opening up their regulatory frameworks in a way that they can be interoperable with other frameworks across the 55 African markets we have.
Thank you, Michael. And on the concept of frameworks and interoperability agreements, Nitesh, I don't know if you have a view or a comment on that, but I'd love to bring you in here.
I think, as we were saying earlier, it's very ambitious. We've got the building blocks, but we need to make these things work. And I think we're at the early stages of the African continental free trade area coming to life. And I think that is a major as a result of the precedents and the enforcement.
Thank you. Thank you, Nitesh. So I wanted to bring in a comment here from one of our attendees. They state African countries have massive employment issues for their youth. Wouldn't AI be one of the causes for making the situation worse? And Sifo, I think this might be a great segue to a recent development at Google. They are deeply involved, obviously, in advancing digital transformation across the continent, from infrastructure to innovation and skills development. But most recently, Google announced a partnership with the United Nations International Telecommunication Union, which is aimed at empowering young people through robotics and emerging technologies to drive youth-led innovation. So obviously, this is an exciting development, really speaks to the intersection of technology and youth in the workforce. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about what this partnership looks like in practice and how you think this might affect or increase the ability for the youth to have more of a play in the innovation of AI.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one thing that we recognize at Google is that AI is a tool. It's a tool that is going to be used and can be used for us to be able to achieve the goals that we have. But behind it all, it still requires the necessary people with the necessary skills. So this is where I think that question might come from in terms of how do we then ensure that we have a workforce in Africa that is going to have the necessary skills in order to be able to make use of tools like AI as we move forward in our digital economies. And with this in mind, this is the approach that we have in terms of trying to make sure that skills are provided and we build an ecosystem and a workforce that has the necessary skills in order to be able to survive and make use of the tools that are there. So our approach really is from as basic as foundational level training to college and university training to trainings, for instance, to local startups and innovators, even into research as well. So the announcement that you're referring to with the UN ITU, which we made a few weeks ago at the UN General Assembly, in partnership with the I Am Angel Foundation, really is aimed at trying to reach, and we are bolstering an existing initiative by the ITU, where they have been working across the continent. And with our partnership, our additional partnership, they will be targeting five countries on the continent, which is South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, and Nigeria. And they will be providing robotics and AI skills to young people between the ages of 10 and 18 through a series of various school-related activities, regional and national competitions, which would lead to a global competition in Geneva. The whole point of having robotics, and it's as a Robotics for Good youth initiative that the ITU has been running for some time now. And the entire purpose of that is to, first of all, provide the necessary skills for young people to be able to start thinking about how to make use of technology to solve societal issues. I had the pleasure of attending the South Africa initiative and launch of this robotics. And the theme of that day and what the kids were solving for, making use of kind of robotic applications, was how do we solve for food security? We can all agree that this is something that is quite a key issue and a key factor on the African continent. And I saw these kids build robots from as simple as planting seeds, building systems to plant seeds. They built systems for harvesting and making harvesting processes a little bit better and easier, making use of the robotics technology. So you might think, well, what's a competition of kids fixing or building robots in a room one day going to kind of solve for Africa? But here, I think these are kind of essential skills that they're developing in relation to kind of systems thinking, critical thinking. You don't necessarily want to teach a kid what to think, but you want to teach them how to think, right? So as we're thinking about Africa having some of the potential in relation to having the youngest population and the largest workforce. These are the kids that are going to be the workforce for the rest of the world in a couple of years, right? And as we're talking about the 2063 plan, we are what? 10 years into that plan, so there's about 40 years to go. So these are the kids that are actually going to be that workforce that is driving the innovation on the continent. And for me, and how I think about it, AI has got the potential then to assist and ensure that their futures and they're able to achieve their set goals moving forward. So the risks are there in terms of how it might affect the current labor force. But I think what we as a continent need to think about is how do we transition existing workforce into that phase of being able to make use of AI and technology to assist them in their jobs and to drive into other functions, but also equip the upcoming generation in terms of then being able to make use of this technology as they are the future workforce. They will already be equipped, and that's why I think for us we want to start when we think about skilling. We want to start at that foundational phase as young as possible, so that these skills are something that they grow up with and they can use as they are the work in the future. Yeah.
Thank you, Sipo. And just to quickly, we have a couple minutes before we have to take a break, but I wanted to just incorporate Shefali here because I know she, one, teaches critical thinking and decision making to young women in India. And in the context of AI, she's talked about it, how it's being sold as transformational to Africa. I know, Shefali, excuse me, you have experience with certain innovators in the space who've actually created solutions that are benefiting their local communities. I think that really does tie in well with what Sipo was just talking about, but I'd love to hear and for you to share with everyone kind of what some of these innovations are look like, and then what that impact will have, in a long-term basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. So I'll build on Sipo's points essentially, and also draw upon the fact that I have been teaching for 14 years and teaching critical thinking and decision making as essential skills, when human discernment will be the big differentiator between somebody who uses AI passively versus actually does something which is relevant to their context. So I wanted to mention an Africa Prize winner, Margaret Panjeku from Kenya, who grew up observing bee colonies. And she was able to, from her observation, draw the line from the collapse between the collapse of bee colonies and collapse of food ecosystems. So she built a fairly simple IoT-based solution whereby farmers can be informed by a text message if the conditions in a beehive actually fall below desirable for the bees to survive, and they could take corrective action. By networking them together, there is collective intelligence in that distributed infrastructure. And she's now able to essentially help her own community. And therefore, the key thing to build on Sipo's example is that the technologies that already exist need to be thought of in new ways to solve problems that are very specific to particular communities. And then the bigger problem of do we have this infrastructure and do we have energy and do we have data and compute becomes a smaller, more localized challenge. There was a comment in the Q&A about solar power use. And that is something that she has built into her solution. It's not for nothing that she won the Africa Prize. She solved a problem that was meaningful to her community. So in teaching critical thinking and decision-making to young upcoming students, one of the things I say to my communities of students going over the years is don't be a hovercraft in your own life. Observe what is going on around you, engage with it, almost like you are a submarine, at least a boat, if not a submarine. Engage with it so you understand the different component parts that can benefit from your observation, that can actually benefit from your involvement, and where you source the intelligence that you're looking for, you combine it in ways that they're meaningful. To me, when something is sold as transformational, the transformation is very specific to the context. And that would be my way of how I teach the young people coming up. The only other point I would add is who's actually accruing the surplus? Is it the producer of the technology or is it the consumer of the technology? In developed nations, 30 to 40% of the surplus actually accrues to the producer. The number is less kind to producers in the developing world, but then one has to ask that question and put it in front of the whole continent on which a lot of world will rely with all the youth that is available or that's upcoming there, is do you want to be a producer of tech or do you want to be a consumer of tech, or both? And your vantage point will actually make all the difference.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those insights. So as I promised at the outset, we will take a break until 35 minutes after the hour. So that leaves us with about 8 minutes. We will be silencing our mics and closing our cameras, but we will be back on live in just 8 minutes from now. So thank you, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for part 2 of our session. We're going to kick off now with local innovation. So just for purposes of setting the context, here's a reality check. Africa's AI innovations in health, agriculture, and fintech are globally recognized, yet most remain fragmented pilots with limited funding and scaling. Less than 2% of global AI venture capital reaches African startups, and most of that is concentrated in the big 4 that I mentioned earlier: Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt. And Nitesh, I'd like to point to you in the context of healthcare as a major opportunity. What are you seeing in this space, and what are you seeing as far as advancements or regulatory frameworks that should govern medical AI to ensure safety while enabling access?
I think I touched on it earlier, just giving some practical examples, but I think that, we had internet access and the advent of telemedicine that got a real boost during COVID because there was a need. And I think that we're going to see all of these unique cases driving innovation in this space because people are going to be able to see the utility so quickly and then realize how they can adapt it to their own circumstances. But we do know that in an environment such as healthcare or financial services, these are spaces where you have to be appropriately regulated. So I think the innovation will always lead and the regulation will lag, but there's going to have to be a little bit of a closer development in this space. Otherwise, we're going to run the risks of some bad instances and some people getting harmed in the process. Separate to healthcare, I think in terms of policy development, and this is also just a little bit anecdotal, but I don't think it would be a discussion about AI if we didn't raise some boogeyman of what could happen with AI. And I think a lot of my work and career has been spent in public policy development. And it's going to be a very interesting case where we may be used to uneven playing fields as to who has a seat at the table to be able to advocate for policy changes and policy development. But what's going to happen when AI itself starts using all of its compute power to lobby for policy which suits it? So I think that we are definitely in an interesting space, but I think when it comes to healthcare and financial services, we're going to have to make sure that regulation doesn't lag too far behind. But I think there are going to be many unique cases, as I said again, in terms of that micro innovation, which is then going to drive the need for regulation.
Absolutely. And I think your comment is a great segue into a point that was raised here by one of our attendees from Zambia. He says that what should Africa prioritize considering the landscape and historical context? One, information delivery on AI as a practice, for example, in education systems, or two, governance policy frameworks. And, I think that's a great kind of synergy with your point around, is policy going to get ahead of the technology? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I think more to what Sipo was saying, I would say that the education element and sort of inculcating this in the next generation is going to be fundamental for us. The policy will evolve, like with any other major development that's happened throughout time. We will adapt. But I think the greater opportunity lies is if we can really get people to embrace AI by bringing it to the top of the agenda, like I said, at a very high level with things like the G20 or the AU. But I think if we can build it into school curricula, and we also know that with the youth, they don't have that built-in fear. They're going to embrace it. It's going to be natural, as we can see how people have embraced touch screens and cell phones, etc., even when they are illiterate, uneducated, rural, etc. So I think that foundational building blocks for the youth, very important. I'm sure that policy is going to follow innovation.
Perfect. Thank you. Just hopping back now to continental leadership and integration. Many observers note that AU frameworks on digital and AI have struggled to really gain traction on harmonizing national approaches. So I was curious, and this is for the group, anyone can pick this one up, but how can AFTA complement AU frameworks to advance Agenda 2063's vision of integrated markets as well as shared prosperity?
Well, I think let me just try and volunteer something to get the conversation going. I have had the opportunity to engage with the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area, Wamkele Mene, and he's absolutely passionate about driving intra-African trade. And I think that as you start to see the trade happening in places where it didn't happen, I think that's going to then lead to the opening of the mindset when it comes to people in terms of the opportunities, but also in terms of the guardrails which are required. But I think that we struggle on a very basic level, not just in the AI context, and we are trying to foster development in every aspect. But I think that the African Continental Free Trade Area coming alive with all the right instruments and now having the Secretariat in Ghana and driving it under good leadership is going to make these things a reality.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Shefali, I see your hand is up.
Yeah. Thank you, Tiffany. So I was thinking of the other free trade sort of union that is available for the world to witness, which is in Europe. And one of the things that I'm thinking of is what Michael said earlier about needing or not needing visas to travel between countries. And the whole Schengen Agreement in Europe made that possible for 25 countries to just ease the flow of talent and of capital. And then the third newest factor of production in this conversation is essentially data. So I think lessons that can be picked out from, I have worked on several European Commission policy projects, and my insights come from my own anecdata. One is that the consensus building process is long, arduous, unpleasant, but eventually leads to something that people kind of agree with because they participated in the process of making that consensus. And the second thing is something that the UK experienced when they were trying to negotiate a Brexit agreement with the European Commission as a whole, is that the other side actually went and talked to every member state to understand their point of view before presenting a unified perspective to the UK. So the UK was in effect set against a consensus that was backed by all the member countries in the European Union. And I think if the lessons can be taken away, they should be about actually talking amongst people and identifying what their pain points are and arriving at a consensus that maximizes the overall benefit so that people, when the consensus is arrived at, do not sabotage it in favor of particular national interests. So I think that kind of learning from another free trade zone might be useful because this is obviously a much bigger, 5 times bigger population numbers, diversity wise, much bigger thing. But we can actually take into account what we have learned about talent and capital flows, as well as taking into account that a very big factor of production is data in this instance.
Thank you, Shefali. Attilia?
I think Michael was first. Michael, if you want to go, then I'll pick up on the data conversation that Shefali had also brought up. Yeah.
I apologize, Michael. I did not see your hand up.
Oh, good, Tiffany. I just wanted to add on to what Nitesh introduced from his conversation with the Secretariat. And as I mentioned to you yesterday, Tiffany, we had a group of African family businesses, large African family businesses here in Ghana about 2 weeks ago, assembled by one of our Launch Africa portfolio companies. And essentially, these are businesses that have monthly turnovers of about $200 million on average. Collectively, there are about 50 businesses from Southern Africa, East, West, and North, and collectively they employ over 200,000 Africans. And one of the big lessons that came out of that conversations with AFTA is that how do businesses engage AFTA to understand the frameworks and the protocols that they've put in place that are supposed to facilitate and encourage intra-African trade and movement of goods, services, people, and capital. And the problem still remains. The intent is there, the protocols and the frameworks are there, but then there's still a gap between AFTA and the private sector, which is what largely drives the economic development of the continent. And speaking from a VC perspective, I mean, we as Launch Africa are one of the most active Pan-African investors on the continent, looking at early stage businesses. And a challenge that still remains, obviously, looking at the companies we back is one, they're unable to easily scale across multiple markets. So how do we help them solve for that? We drive partnerships with corporates and large family enterprises. So some of these businesses that have been around, for instance, there's a particular one from Namibia that was just celebrating their 100th year anniversary this year. And the conversations are around, okay, how can we, on the investor side, backing some of the most innovative companies and solutions out of the continent, help you, one, extend the legacy of your family businesses, but also bring in a new, fresh approach to how you scale and innovate and grow. And these businesses, as big as they are, have the same challenges that our startups that are quite way younger, but super innovative are facing. And what Nitesh also touched on the G20 summit, which is happening in South Africa this year. I was having a conversation with the CEO of the business Unity South Africa. And what he was suggesting to the family businesses is that we need more business unity groups that are, again, going to be regionally based, similar to how we have the big four markets. And then these business unity organizations need to then approach institutions like the AU and AFTA to understand how can we work together, then disseminate that back to their member companies and member businesses. If it doesn't happen in that type of structured way, we're still going to, in the next 10, 20 years, be speaking of these very nice intentions of the African Union and the AFTA to, one, have an African passport, which will open movement of capital, people, trades, goods, and services. But it has to be a push and pull from both sides. So that divide can only be bridged when there's a push and pull from the business community. Nitesh is very right that policy and regulation will always follow innovation. I think globally, we are yet to see an instance where policy has preceded innovation. And I think it's no different for the African continent. So I think a recommendation here, and obviously pushing it to the speakers and our audience, is if you're in a business community and you're wondering how can we leverage some of these protocols or frameworks and make it work for us, it has to be sometimes we have to do the difficult work to make our work easier. Launch Africa Ventures, I'll give you an example. We're in existence for only 5, 7, maximum of 9 years. We invest in 133 companies in our fund one, and we need to exit, and we need to generate liquidity for our fund, which also signals something good for the ecosystem on the continent. So how do we drive this? We know IPO as an option for exit on the African continent is still a far-fetched dream, but we've seen secondaries really drive liquidity for investors who are putting in capital in early stage businesses or growth stage businesses on the continent. So we've taken it up upon ourselves as a fund to approach corporates, large enterprises, your banks, your telcos, your insurance companies, and then we are orchestrating these relationships for our portfolio companies. And we've seen large enterprises and family businesses either merge and acquire smaller businesses that are more innovative to further scale their operations across the continent. And it is working. So I think we in the business community, speaking for folks in the business community, need to do a bit more in where we can, reaching out to the frameworks and protocols, whether locally or regionally, and find ways we can make our work easier, because either way, what we do benefits the entire ecosystem as a whole. So it's not really siloed. But if we progress the way we are, we'll keep saying there's momentum, there's intent, but we'll be speaking about the same thing. I'll end with a few figures, Tiffany, for you. Obviously, Africa has one of the largest free trade area and one of the fastest growing market. If you look at it as a whole, you have 11 of the world's 20 fastest growing economies based here in Africa. To C4's earlier point, I think by 2050, the projections are that 1 in 4 people will be African. And obviously 60% of the continent is still under the age of 25. And to Otilia's earlier point on the penetration rates of internet or mobile, I think if you compare, I was reading a report, and if you compare where we are as of, I think 2024, when it comes to mobile penetration, we are up about 45% compared to where we were in 2010, which was just slightly under 10%. So there's all these big signals that are pointing to the prosperity of the continent, but it's going to take collaboration and harmonization of efforts if we are going to move the needle globally as this big frontier market, which is the last frontier market, essentially, to take over the world. That sounds a bit evil, but yeah, it's to take over the world.
I was muted. Thank you, Michael. No, that doesn't sound evil. That is the case. Otilia, I believe you had your hand up, if I'm not mistaken.
I did, but how do you go after that when Michael has kind of taken it all and landed with the punchline? But maybe the one little thing I would add, as into that very beautifully framed response, is that the policies, the guidance, the intent is there. So even if I look at the Continental Free Trade Agreement, there's a digital protocol that sets out, cross-border data flows and all the juicy things you want to see. The right things, actually, but it's not been ratified. So there's a little bit of a gap in political will in landing some of these initiatives and translating them into enforceable instruments. So I think it may be to add to Michael's point there, that part of what businesses should be lobbying for is to ensure that these protocols are ratified, and so that they're enforceable and so that they can actually benefit from the goodness that is already there. On the topic of political will, I think there's also I think Shefali also spoke to this, the competing interests. How do you get people on the same page? Do we actually have the 2-3 biggest voices from an economic perspective leading the conversation? I often feel like you need those who are likely to be the dissidents, because they don't have a reason to be a part of the pool, because they can otherwise try and go it on their own, because their economy is otherwise quite efficient. They can see a good opportunity, and they have they have funding possibilities where they could possibly solve for this from a national perspective. You need for them to be as bought into championing the African as a narrative, and I think we don't have all of those big ones at the table, and that's part of why the Afro-Continental Free Trade Agreement has been, in some ways, sluggish in getting to the scale of implementation that we would hope for. So I think there's something that we need to do in advocating for political will in the most powerful of our countries on the continent, because those that are currently championing it are not necessarily the ones who, have the ability to actually push this through.
Thank you. We do have a comment here. How do we manage the AI integration with the authenticity of our ancestral indigenous knowledge systems? And I think this ties back in part to Shefali's comments, where she said that you first need to have consensus to build process, that you need to identify pain points, and you want to maximize benefits. So I was curious, Shefali, do you have a comment on that? Like, how can you maintain authenticity as it relates to some of the local traditions and the indigenous realities that occur as we're looking at this evolving artificial intelligence landscape?
So it has to be said that the large language models that are being advanced in different markets are hugely reliant on being trained on knowledge and data sets that are codified knowledge. And one of the things with a lot of rich African cultures, and I come from a culture where there was a lot of oral transmission of knowledge as well. So it is an interesting challenge. And it's, in my view, it's a conversation that each nation must have. What is it that is our indigenous knowledge base? Do we really want it to be fed into an LLM that did not originate here, or even a small language model that didn't originate here? How is it going to power the innovations that are relevant to our context, that are solving our problems? Because these, obviously, the wisdom and the knowledge that is evolved in a particular country has evolved in that context, in that country's context. I think it's a conversation to be had. In fact, in the break, I was just catching up on some of the stuff that I was reading. Microsoft and AWS are lobbying in India to have exemptions to the copyright system in order that they can train their tools on Indian copyrighted materials. This is 2025, and companies are asking for exemptions from copyright regimes in countries. But the fact that they are having to ask is itself a very interesting observation in power dynamics. So I know I haven't addressed the question, that I looked at that question and it was a powerful question, but we have to have conversations about how the global South is going to actually look at their own traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, as well as intellectual property that is resident in the culture, whether it is the image of the Maasai tribes, or it is, which they have, as you know, I have written about it in my forthcoming book, or it is something else by way of knowledge. These are conversations that the Global South must absolutely have. And they are not fully finished or complete conversations yet, but they must be happening somewhere. And they should, if they are.
Thank you. Sibo, please.
Sure. So this question, actually, because I also noted it, it takes me back to the conversation we had earlier about AI sovereignty, and the point that I made that AI sovereignty is not about kind of isolation, or it's not about the data localization, but it's more about nations building themselves the capacity in order to be able to use AI to meet their needs. This is exactly it, right? So how do we maintain our heritage? How do we maintain various different aspects of our culture? I always use the example that it's very difficult for me, I would not expect John, who's sitting in San Francisco, to write an LLM that's going to speak Xhosa to me or speak Zulu for me and understand the various nuances of the language and the various different aspects of the culture. It's going to take the South African government, for instance, or the South African ecosystem to say, right, we need LLMs or SLMs that are going to work and be able to meet this cultural need that we have within the country. How do we then take that capacity? Take an API, for instance, from one of the existing ones, tweak it, make it local, make it meet the local needs. Then you bring on the expertise from locals who are going to then, how do we then take, for instance, the spoken culture, which Shefali is speaking to, which is quite a big thing for a lot of the cultures on the African continent. How do we then take that knowledge and make sure that we get it in some sort of codified way that we can then make it accessible to the models? I know for us, for instance, we from a Google point of view, we have a partnership with Masakani Research AI Hub to onboard about 40 African languages, and they're doing that kind of work. But even with that, that's kind of a very tip of the iceberg when you think about the 2,000 plus languages that are on the African continent, right? So the more of those kinds of projects that could come, which are based with local talent, built on local LLMs or SLMs, to be able to meet the particular needs of the continent, that's really the best way I think we would be able to achieve what the question was asking for.
Right. And Ottilia, please, we'd love to hear your view.
I just want to add one little thing because I feel like there's such a big opportunity here. Currently, if we look at what are the areas from a investment perspective where more needs to be done, I think investing in culture and the arts from an African perspective is actually where there is potential for growth. And this ties somehow, I think, as well to this unique positioning that we would have in the AI era. And I think we'll start to see a lot more. I don't know for Michael, who sees how the money flows, if there is a growing investment in preservation of culture and the arts, because I also think it is one of our most unique factors as an African continent, and we've not utilized it to differentiate or not monetized it enough, actually, maybe even as the other one, because I think we're only starting to see us come alive to how intellectual property rights are something that can actually help us grow industry. And there's something of an opportunity there that I've also even been trying to figure out from a personal perspective. But I do love the contributions that both Shefali and Sipa provided. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. We do have a question here from our audience indicating, I would be interested to hear more from the panelists what they think are the most significant but solvable human rights issues that affect the continent as it relates to AI. Is it labor issues with moderators, environmental impacts, potential mass job displacement? And for context, this particular contributor is an AI optimist, but also a realist.
I think I'll go if nobody else is. I run the Directors Book Club, and one of the books that I assigned in this season, as it were, was Karen Howe's book, Empire of AI. And it was interesting in the conversations around that book, how it was a lot of people's first introduction to what amount of, I used to joke earlier that ML is not machine learning, it's manual labor. It was people's first introduction to how much manual labor goes into tagging and labeling of data in poorer countries, so that that material can then actually be used in training data sets. So to the question, how many of these challenges can be solved? I think these challenges are unfortunately baked into the generative AI models that are being peddled at the moment. And it may be controversial to say it, but I would very much suggest that if we really need an overhaul of all of this, then we have to have the whole debate around what are the input factors, and poor countries' labor going in and cleaning up images, etc., is an input factor into the development of these models. That's the question we need to ask. We are not really solving, we are actually exacerbating those problems. I am an optimist too. I'm not a denialist. As I mentioned to you in our briefing, Tiffany, I did my undergrad thesis in robotics over 30 years ago. So I started early and I watched this debate all through. I worked in explainable AI, and I talk about the issues surrounding this from a policy, strategy, and governance perspective quite a lot. But these are uncomfortable questions we have to confront if we are to then socialize the entire set of products and technologies to the whole world.
Thank you. Sipa, please.
Sure. So until now, we've talked about, and largely on the African continent, about, for instance, the digital gap that exists, right? And this comes in various different iterations. When you're thinking about the gender gap that it exacerbates, when you think about societal gaps where those that have access to these tools are able to kind of thrive and prosper, and those that don't have are not able to do so in the same manner. We're at a critical point where AI is either going to exacerbate what we've seen now in terms of the digital divide that has existed, or it's actually going to help solve the problem. Part of the issue that we face with, and we're going to have to tackle, especially on the continent, is making sure that all of the advantages and all the great things that we've talked about that can come from the potential of AI, that is not restricted to a particular group of people, right? We do need to make sure that this is something, and these advantages are something that can be accessible to the greater populace. And it is unfortunate that, for instance, when you think about some of these tools, just general tools, yes, besides the infrastructure issues that we've already spoken about, having access to them in terms of kind of devices, having access to the tools themselves, for instance, is also has become better, but it's not quite there where it needs to be. So I may not have a clear answer for you, but I think it's something that's top of mind for all of us, because we can make things worse. And I agree with Shefali here that it's something that requires us to kind of sit and talk about how, as nations and as a continent, we're going to address that. Because if we leave it unaddressed, we are really going to make the issues worse for women, for instance, or for people within rural areas who are not able to access the great advantages of that this technology could bring, as spoken to before.
Thank you. Michael, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Tiffany. Just great contributions by Shefali and Sipo. And I want to give a selfish recommendation here. One of our portfolio companies that is South African based, they're an AI talent marketplace, Zindi. They just crossed the 90,000 data scientist mark. And they've been responsible for providing AI talent to organizations such as ABSA, Liquid Intelligent, which is owned by Cassava Technologies, and they're really struggling with the demand for AI talent. So touching on Sipo's point on educating our youthful population, and obviously, if you look at it from the government perspective, it's a matter of how do you inculcate this into the educational curriculums so that we're not starting at the youth level. Because I think youth level is what, 18, 25 to 35. That's very late. If you look at comparable markets like the US or Asia or Europe, then we will still lag behind. So I think if we can start earlier, then we have an advantage. In terms of training now for the youth, we have incredible organizations all across the continent that are working on upskilling young talents across the continent in not just technological skills, but especially AI. We have Sun Technologies, which is owned and run by a Ghanaian serial entrepreneur, Fred Swanika. And you have other hubs and incubators across the continent that are edtechs focusing on upskilling talent on especially AI, and whether this is computing or it's working with natural languages. There is something happening. And I think the more we can push for these and have that buy-in from the governments in inculcating it into our educational systems, then the better for us when we're talking about the AU's Vision 2063 or the local visions that governments like Kenya have, Vision 2030. Technology is changing and moving so fast that some of these visions that were set by governments, for instance, I'm thinking of Kenya, I don't think, not to shoot myself in the foot here, but I'm not aware of a plan to include AI as language or as an opportunity to train our young populations in Kenya in that vision. And so in that way, we still remain lagging behind and we are always playing catch up. Now, on the other hand, Tiffany, I do wear a catalytic funding hat where I support the German Development Bank in the implementation of the Develop Ventures program. and essentially just providing non-dilutive capital as a catalytic option for small companies, particularly in East Africa. And one of the challenges we've seen with companies utilizing AI to build into their solutions that are, focused on very local environments and geographies is the application of trying to take global AI applications and fitting it into the very unique context that is present locally. And that just creates a whole lot of problems for them. And so, right, to Shefali and Sipo's point, I think the access and the ability to work with tools that can be tailored specifically when you look at a market like Tanzania, for example, where the largely spoken language is Swahili, it is very difficult to translate some of these very technical AI terms into Swahili in a way that has a relevance locally in that market. And so not just having access, but then having access to tools that you can actually work with. And the reason I say this is a selfish point is because I see an opportunity for players like ourselves in the VC world that are investing in very early stage innovative businesses, solving real life, everyday African problems. Right. If you look at Zindi, they are able to run 2 to 3 hackathons a year. And essentially through these hackathons, they're able to source for talent for some of these global conglomerates. If you're talking about Google or ABSA or Liquid Intelligent, which is one of the biggest technological company in terms of fiber optic provision on the continent, that is moving the needle. So finding local solutions to local problems, and by backing organizations selfishly again, such as Launch Africa Ventures. And I say this because we are a largely retail investor-driven fund, unlike our partners in the ecosystem that maybe have a DFI as an anchor network, as an anchor LP, could go a long way in making a difference. I'll give you context with numbers. Out of our 133 companies that we invested in Fund 1 over a period of 3 years, we were able to create about 60,000 jobs. And obviously, the market cap that now collectively we've created is $3 billion across the two funds. And this is from backing 160 companies. So these are 300 founders that are running 160 companies in over 25 markets. And the jobs we've created from the last survey we ran, and I think we did a survey on just 90 companies, 90 or 95 companies that we've invested in, we were able to get 60,000 in terms of jobs created. Now, we can further break down these jobs into gig jobs, which are the jobs that these companies create for women. Speaking to the gender gap that Sifo was touching on, how many jobs did we create that are gig jobs? How many jobs did we create that are tech jobs or skilled jobs? Essentially jobs that require a specific type of skill in the technological spectrum to do that job. So for instance, is it data analysts for Liquid Intelligent? We've been able to draw down this data from the companies we've invested in. And so that's just one way of going about it when it comes to how do we make the access available to markets, environments that would ideally not have the opportunity to access this. We can back innovative founders building incredible solutions that are on the ground and touching everyday real life Africans and solving their problems using innovative technologies such as what AI presents as a tool.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think all of these comments are a great transition into governance and AI safety. We're talking about models, access to local information, making sure that there's appropriate inclusion. And so from a reality check perspective, in August 2025, the UN General Assembly unanimously endorsed 2 landmark global mechanisms, the first of which is the Global Dialogue on AI Governance, and then also the Independent International Scientific Panel on AI, which in sum was to make AI governance more inclusive, interoperable, and also evidence-based. And so I wanted to shift to you, Sipo, because your CEO has repeatedly stated that AI is too important not to regulate. He's emphasized the need for thoughtful, well-designed local inputs to balance innovation as well as risk mitigation. So can you share more about Google's AI principles and their approach to governance?
Sure. So yes, Sunda is known for famously saying AI is too good not to be regulated, but also says too good not to be regulated well. So there is a thing about how then that regulation is set up. So Google has been an AI first company since about 2016. And in around 2018, that's when we issued our first kind of basic of principles, which governed how we as Google start to think about how we're going to be using AI and what are the various different things that we'd be willing to do. We've recently updated those principles, but really they maintain kind of the ethos around the issues that we are looking at. So, firstly, for instance, we want to make sure that whatever AI applications and however we think about AI, it's something that's going to be socially beneficial. We need to make sure that we are avoiding creating biases, for instance, and also making sure that we are building and testing them for safety, so that they can be used in such a manner. So with all of this, it really is a more of a balancing act, right? In making sure that whatever guardrails that you do put in order to kind of protect against the risks that exist, because that's one thing I think we shouldn't have rose-colored glasses on this. There are risks to implementation of AI and AI systems, and we need to make sure that there are guardrails in order to protect us and people from these. So some of the things that we think about in terms of principles and think about how we should be governing AI. So the first thing that we would say is that it does need to be risk-based, and that's proportional based on the risk. We don't want to have kind of long-bearing rules being put into place for areas that are not as risky. So we do need to think about how we put together a proportionate risk-based framework that is going to allow for innovation to continue, but protecting from the relevant risks. Obviously, yes, it has to be pro-innovation. It does have to make sure that innovation is not stifled from continuing in the work that it does do. But one of the things that we've been thinking about, and I think a lot about it in the context of our conversation today, but also in the context of when we think about policy on the African continent, is making sure that we're avoiding fragmentation. It's going to be difficult for a person or a company or an entity who's trying to deploy AI systems for the market. Is got one rule, set of rules in South Africa. When they jump over into Botswana and Namibia, they have another different set of rules to apply to. So some avoidance of fragmentation there is one of the best ways to kind of think about how do we get there. But really, our approach has remained the same since about 2018. Again, society is first, making sure we address risks such as biases, and trade biases, for instance, and also making sure that we build them with the protections for safety in place so that we are accountable to people. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. And Shefali, I'm curious, in your experience, how should boards, and actually this also goes to Nitesh, but how should boards and regulators prepare to oversee and monitor AI risks and opportunities? I'd love to hear your views from your experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany. So I think the first thing is to recognize this as a stakeholder issue, not just a shareholder issue, which boards of corporate companies might be tempted to narrow down on. So that is one. The second is to ask the question, what is the strategic direction you're pursuing? Or why are you doing this? Mm-hmm. And also, what is your reality? What is the reality that you're overseeing? The reality of the industry that you oversee, the reality of the company that you provide scrutiny to. And those are the earliest questions, but I will move this up a little slightly sideways. Bain Capital's estimate is that all the current providers or players of technologies in the generative AI space need a collective revenue of around $1 trillion by 2030. This is 2025 November, just to kind of situate that on a temporal basis. And that means, and that is to provide any kind of return on the huge investments that have already been made and that are continuing to be sought. Now, if we think about the 1 trillion revenue collectively coming from all the people who are going to implement these things, what is the value we need to actually spend that 1 trillion? If the 1 trillion was coming from one set of customers or one organization as a customer, what is the return on investment do we need to see in order to sign off that 1 trillion spend? Which then brings me to the point that 80% of the pilots are reportedly not delivering. But the few that are, you might have seen this week, JP Morgan CEO said that they are investing about $2 billion and they are seeing benefits. And some of the benefits that they have outlined are in fraud reduction, for example. So the ones that are, those who are claiming that there is any value being realized, there are some fairly outsized claims. So from the point of view of governance, the questions to be asked are, why are we doing this? What direction are we headed? What is our baseline? What is our reality? And what is the return we are expecting? And more importantly, how are we calculating that return? Because you can't keep moving the goalpost and say, okay, we have done this, we've done this. One of the things we hear is productivity gains. We have to ask, how do businesses calculate productivity that you're going to be able to say, this is my baseline and this is the gain I have made? So I think to your question, how should boards prepare to oversee? They should actually first understand the landscape. Then they should understand their own particular reality, their own goals, their own strategic objectives. Just because a hammer is available doesn't mean they're in the business of nails. So they have to think about what is it that they are trying to solve, and then formulate their own approach, which balances opportunity with the risks the organization might be getting exposed to. And one of the risks that I hear about the most from a lot of director conversations is the creation of a shadow organization, which is doing things the way they want. And most of the execs and the boards are not aware that employees are doing these things on the side. And they're not doing it from a malicious perspective. They're just doing it because they are trying to figure out what it is that they could bring to the management or to the executives to say we could do this with these tools that are available.
Okay, thank you. Nitesh?
Yeah, I think to pick up on one of the things that Shafali was saying is we really need directors of boards in exercising oversight and corporate governance to understand what it is that they need to be looking out for, because they may be totally ignorant. And I think that that's where a lot of education needs to take place, whether it's, the equivalent of an institute of directors or these types of discussions, to be able to conscientize people. I think we've seen waves of this, what is it that you need to look out for in terms of fraud, cybercrime, environmental issues. Similarly, in the AI space, I would say that even if you are a very experienced business person, experienced person sitting on the boards, and you've seen all kinds of business and innovations and multiple jurisdictions, you still may not have a clue what to look out for when it comes to AI. So I think basic awareness and basic education, which also goes to the earlier point of we need to make sure that AI is elevated on the agenda and it's being communicated constantly by leaderships and major organizations beyond just talking to the elites. I think it's something that needs to be brought into broader conversation all the time.
And Nitesh, in the earlier conversation that we had, you mentioned the concept of cascading information down, right? The AU needs to push information down so the local players really do understand more about policy, more about what the go forward wishes are, and that it actually reaches the people who are actually at issue and at play in kind of developing some of these innovations, including farmers, small business owners, upskilling of youth. Do you have any other comments along that point?
I just want to re-emphasize the importance of communicating. I think that there can be sometimes major assumptions that people understand, or they're participating in this, or how could you not know, because it's all around you, but in your little microcosm. And I think that when you look at South Africa, it's a very diverse country. Yes, it's part of the G20, but at the same time, if you look at the Gini coefficient, it's one of the most unequal places on earth. And as a result, I think we can never take anything for granted, and we have to assume that we have to over-communicate.
Right. Okay. And this is for the overall group. You know, we've talked a lot about structure, frameworks, policy, governance. What does an African-led AI safety framework look like in your view? Ottilia, your expression looks as though you have something to share.
I did. I was trying to think, do we need another framework? Is probably where my thinking was, right? I think we have very good building blocks in what we already have. From a continental perspective, I think the AU has given great guidance where the opportunity is from an AI perspective, the direction that policy should be going. I think we have, from a trade perspective, the African Continental Free Continent, well, AFCFTA has all the relevant protocols in place from a country perspective. Like you said, you have more than 30 countries that have some sort of data protection or cybersecurity related regulation. We've seen a couple of countries across the continent do AI strategies: South Africa, Kenya, Egypt, Morocco. I think Kenya recently issued an AI policy. South Africa's working on theirs, and there's a few others across the continent that are doing the same. I don't think we need another framework. Is my honest, on at least that would be my contribution. That's why I had a bit of a funny face, because I was trying to think, do we need to be structuring? But maybe the question should be, are there some unique concerns that we have from an African perspective when it comes to AI safety that we would like to elevate in some way in our policy, in the policy frameworks that we're building, that already exist, and those that we're building? That might be how I would reframe this. I think the concerns that we have, mostly around data. Is it representative of us? How do we get more data as well? That is also a concern, as a lot of our data is not yet even codified. As we said, some of it is learned cultural heritage. And so there's a lot of work, I guess, to be done around African data, access to that data, how we protect it. There might be something there. But otherwise, I think we have everything we need already in the frameworks that exist around creating a safe ecosystem for the use of AI without needing to over engineer here. I know some might argue we're seeing growing conversations around having kill switches in some countries. There's a big move and a focus around that's driven in some ways by the existential threat that some believe AI poses. I think that is maybe we are still a little bit far off to even understand if we needed a kill switch, and if we did, what that sort of kill switch would look like. So, sure. Yeah. In summary, my blurb is to say I don't think we need another framework.
Thank you. No, that's a fair point, and I appreciate your perspective. I'd like to turn it over before we go to our rapid fire. Anyone else have a view on that point? Are we aligned with Ottilia, or would perhaps another framework or a hybrid of such would be beneficial for the overall continent?
Yeah, I agree with Ottilia. I don't think we need more frameworks. I think we just need to make what we have work, and then we can decide whether we need more frameworks.
Okay. Very quickly before the rapid fire, I just want to get in one last comment from the audience here. Suppose we revisited this theme in 10 years. What would a successful AI-based outcome look like? What benchmarks should we be looking for along the way? Let's make that the rapid fire, actually, so we're mindful of time. Sipo, I'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think if we want to go back in 10 years and look, we should be looking at whether we're achieving what we set out to do. So are we having societies that have got an equal opportunity and access to economic activity? Are we having prosperity? Are we seeing the things that we set out to achieve come out from that? Are we seeing a community where we are, in fact, the leader in the world, as Michael had said, we're taking over the world. How far are we from that, right? So those are the kind of the matrices I would put into place when we do have this conversation 10 years from now and say, hey, how far are we from kind of dealing with all of the infrastructure issues that we're dealing. How far are we in terms of skilling the African youth and the African workforce in terms of use of technology? How far are we in terms of providing and being the labor force for the world? And looking at those kind of clear measures, I think we should be able to state whether AI and the use of it has been able to kind of get us to that point. Yeah, let me stop there.
Thank you. Shefali, I'll go with you next.
So in 10 years from now, I think I would like to look back on my work in stewardship to ask the question, have I created through my work for the generations that are up and coming better social capital, better environmental capital, and better financial wealth conditions, all acting together through the decisions which were in my power while I serve on boards or advise companies or advise small startups, or even work with regulators on creating a more balanced approach to regulating any emerging technology.
Thank you. Insightful. Ottilia, you're up.
And this is Nirvana, 10 years from now. If we have moved forward in integrating as a continent, in figuring out intra-African trade and optimizing the natural resources that we have, including the potential that we have for energy capacity, and have become in some ways the leaders in this space because we have figured out how to use our natural resources to power some of the compute that the rest of the world needs. And we figured out how our youth can be the brains behind, capturing the AI opportunities, more data scientists and all the likes. That is aspirationally what I would hope for, better integrated, more, optimized for our own resources, Africa that's better positioned on the global stage as a leader, among others.
Thank you. Mitesh?
Thank you. I think in 10 years' time, for me, a very successful achievement would be if AI could be built into junior school curriculum. I think you've got to have the disclaimers to say we know that, there's all the issues about are children able to actually go to school and will they be able to access the learning materials? Do they have electricity? But if we can strip some of that away, again, like Ottilia was saying, Nirvana, I think that if we look at this youth bulge that Africa has, and if we can really, from the get-go, build AI into their mentality, then I think we've got a wonderful, bright future.
Thank you so much. And Michael, we could not close out without hearing from you. So very much would appreciate your rapid fire response to the 10-year outlook.
Yeah, thank you, Tiffany. And I think all very valid points. I think for me, what I'd say is a successful AI-driven outcome would be one that is aligned with both the Agenda 2063 and with the with AFTA and the framework and protocols they're creating. And that would essentially be that AI is deeply embedded in Africa's economic integration, policy innovation, and value creation, particularly beyond the big four markets that have been the usual suspects when it comes to AI and funding and innovation on the African continent. So whether that's inclusive, distributed innovation, or what Ottilia, AI-enabled inter-African trade, and also seeing AI directing and guiding capital inflows and investment flows into markets beyond the big four. And obviously looking at, on the policy and governance side, built up capacity with regards to a Pan-African AI governance framework, one that would be aligned hopefully with the African Union data policy framework. And then obviously socioeconomic outcomes that are powered primarily or centrally using artificial intelligence. So in a nutshell, AI embedded into the African economic integration, policy innovation, and value creation.
Thank you so much. These are all such insightful perspectives that I'm sure will be of incredible benefit to our attendees. So thank you, everyone. We are at time. Thank you, everyone, for your time, contributions, your insights. I will note that there are some Q&As that came through that we did not have the opportunity to answer. So for those who submitted them and are still online, we will forward these to our panelists, and hopefully they'll have the opportunity to share some additional perspective to address your views. But overall, thank you everyone for participating in our inaugural event. We hope that you found this informative as well as exciting to be part of. And I just want to say thanks again for your time. So have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, and hope to see you at our next installment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.